Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to Political Party's 10th episode. Unfortunately, the show went to air 5 minutes before our recording was due to start, therefore, we have lost the introductory segment of the show. Nonetheless, stay tuned in for what is, without a doubt, Hamish and I's most proud episode, featuring expert Peter Vicary on the topic of risky business. This is Political Party.
But at what expense?
So like that, I think that's sort of the debate that is getting pushed here. That capitalism fuels innovation and it gives people jobs and stuff, and that's all well and good. I think business needs to exist, but in a world where the system not only like disproportionately harms poor people, but actually, kicks them to the curb and says, "Oh, here's a couple of jobs that not all of you are going to get." I don't particularly think that business is always as good as it possibly could purport itself to be. For example, businesses like Rio Tinto are just allowed to push governments to remove sites from, national parks and World Heritage so they can dig up all the resources that are under the ground, try and sell a finite amount of resources to an increasing amount of people and expect that energy in that system is going to, suffice over time. Like you were saying last week about the aging population, Hamish, that when you've got more people trying to consume a finite amount of resources at an increasing amount of cost because those resources are becoming more scarce, what happens is that you end up, not only destroying the world that we're actually supposed to be living on for the next couple of hundred, years before we're all, drowned and suffocating. But at the moment, as it stands, there's people who cannot afford housing because Australia doesn't have any limits on foreign ownership, and the market is being flooded by people with more money than people who can afford housing, and poor people cannot get jobs, and Indigenous people are having their communities closed so that they can be fracked, for example. I certainly agree that business pushes enough innovation for us to justify its existence, but I don't think the extent to which it has economic hegemony is justified at all. I think when you've got companies like Rio Tinto paying 3% tax and people in the lowest threshold of tax paying 21%, which is where I am, I believe in paying tax, but I don't believe that companies should just get a free ride on tax to try and keep them innovating in Australia, because that's complete and utter exploitative bullshit.
To my mind, what's going on here with what we're seeing in Australia is a regulation failure. I don't think it's the fault of business itself. Businesses are amoral. They will always do whatever brings them the most profit. No, the real problem here is politicians being corrupted and seduced by these businesses in their everlasting quest for profit and turning the forces of politics to the side of business and allowing them to get away with pretty much anything because, but campaign donations. We're seeing a massive amount of this in the USA. Such companies as, we even saw a planned merger of Comcast and Time Warner, two companies that are universally despised throughout America. They haven't got to where they were by building on customer goodwill. They've got to where they were by screwing customers. And the fact that a merger between these two highly selfish, amoral, monopolistic entities was even considered should show you just how bad things are over there when it comes to regulation failure.
Cool. Well, I think we largely agree on most of the same stuff. Definitely business should be regulated when they're really beating up the little guy.
But what happens when you what would happen if we as a society collectively agreed that we should be highly taxing corporations to take the to not only take the, not only to bear the brunt of the tax system to allow some more, liquid capital for the people who need it most. But what if we agreed that taxes should come predominantly from corporations and gave them a tax rate of 15 to 20%, for example?
Then they'd all run out of Australia.
Yeah.
Because there's iron ore and coal and shale gas to be extracted in Australia. It's a hotbed for It's a hotbed for resource.
Here's the thing. Right now, the world is not particularly scarce of resources. There are many regions that have not yet even been explored and investigated for their resources, let alone mined out. There are still
like
places...
Antarctica.
Not even Antarctica. You don't even need to go to Antarctica. You can go to, like, South America, Africa, Russia. The north of Russia is full of resources, and Russia are getting ready to harvest those. The instant that ice melts, they'll be swarming all over it like a pack of angry ants. So, essentially, there are plenty of places for these businesses to run off to. Countries such as Russia, with ailing economies, will welcome them in with open arms, and they will then start mining. But here's the thing. There'll still be business opportunities left in Australia that will possibly be left vacant. These corporations are going to have to make a choice. They're either going to have to leave or stay and get taxed. But if they leave, it'll open up opportunities for domestic business, which could be good, but it would be very hard for domestic business to be viable and raise the required amount of investment capital when you could instead invest in these big corporations that are guaranteed to turn a profit. So I really don't know how effective that kind of a tax rate would be. Although, in principle, I would absolutely agree to it because the government's, we ought to tax corporations because they are more well off than the rest of us. And therefore, their money should be used to help out the poorest in society, even if it is just to help them afford the stuff produced by these corporations. So,
Well,
Tim, what are your thoughts? And, you, Peter.
Well, I think like the real question is, who's better with that money? I think there's no question that like the economy would definitely shrink, so there'd be less money to go around. But like if you gave the money to the government or if you let the corporations use it to invest in technology and improving their communities, I think you'd find that largely, even if it just goes to profit, it's returned to shareholders who probably own shares in, in those businesses, even though that's like probably middle class, upper class Australians. I still think that like what they do with that money, in those local communities to actually get access to, like they build roads so in these remote communities, they can employ a lot of people in indigenous society versus what the government could do with that money, which would be significantly less than how much the corporations would have spent, means that the government probably wouldn't be able to do as much as those corporations because that would be less.
There is an issue I see here, and it leads into my vision of the future, which will be relevant in a few weeks' time. But essentially, the problem with the shareholder system is that it massively limits social mobility because it ensures that money is kept among the middle class, which is slowly transitioning into the upper class. And meanwhile, the price of shares in businesses keeps rising so that poor people who have a very limited amount of disposable income cannot afford to invest in these shares. So you're going to see a lot less social mobility. And then as technology causes more and more jobs to become replaced by automation, you're going to see a world divide in two. There'll be the shareholder producer class who will, produce content for the machines to create and so on and so forth. And the shareholders who will own the machines, invest in them, ensure they keep getting developed. And you'll see this underclass who are completely screwed because there'll be no jobs because the machines will have taken all of them. And they won't have the money to afford shares in these corporations that operate the machines. So you're going to see this massive two-tiered society, and that's the world we're currently headed towards.
But with the amount of money that's consistently and disproportionately shifting upwards, that middle upper kind of innovating shareholding class that you're talking about is going to be a very finite and small amount of people.
Oh, absolutely. But there's still going to be a thing in the new world, and anyone who's not one of them is going to be screwed.
I want to come back to your point, Peter, about how corporations do a lot for indigenous communities and stuff. Like they give them jobs and they give them funding and stuff. Like, sure, the money that they give out is like a drop in the barrel, but like that's still a lot of money that gets given to those communities. So I'm not refuting that. What I'm saying and what my problem is that we have more of a responsibility to human progress than just throwing money at people. I think when a corporation says, okay, we're going to start mining and we're going to dig up your village, that you're living in a different culture, but we're going to give you these like anglicized Western educated jobs and teach you to be not like the culture that you evolved to be. I get that pushes innovation, and I get that pushes, this like overarching body that is like the theorized economy and stuff. And like, I get that the economy is going to grow and stuff, but it's not going to help those people of whom the cultural imperialism is ultimately like going to harm in the long run. And so my problem is that, sure, you can give them jobs, you can give them money, but jobs and money aren't the only responsibility we have as humans.
Absolutely. And I think that indigenous communities can still have subsistence lifestyles. We potentially could just regulate and say, don't mine in those areas. And to
But we don't have that, you know?
Well, we do to a large extent. Like, there are like reserves, and there is a lot of to an extent there is displacement of indigenous Australians, and I think that is terrible and that shouldn't happen. But I don't think like defending that is a good thing, and I don't think many people do. But I think that also these corporations realize that, and they do try to compensate as much as possible when that does happen, at least to avoid legal action. But they do get picked up at the end of the day, and they do pay for it.
I'd actually take Peter's comments a step further and say, well, what is responsibility? Responsibility is a concept for people with a moral compass. Corporations don't have moral compasses. They do what they must to survive and to profit. And the thing is, a lot of these big corporations are a lot more fragile than you'd expect, because yes, they may be making money hand over fist now, but if say 2 or 3 of their big investments were to go wrong, they would be utterly screwed and snapped up in an instant by their more fortunate rivals. So essentially, corporations don't have morals. They're just removing the Aboriginal people and their culture is something that the people running these corporations may not want to do, but ultimately it's an amoral structure.
Well, I think like that's like a bit of a generalization. Like, businesses have morals, sure. They've got like equity boards, and they've got like ethics boards and stuff that decide what's ethical for that business. And although it might come across as incredibly cold-hearted to people like you and I,
Oh, it is.
they still have those systems in place that make those decisions. But those decisions usually come down to choices of, okay, we are going to make a lot of money by digging up this currently Indigenous listed reserve. We're going to deregister that, and we're going to dig it up, but we're going to compensate them. So I feel like that business ethical boards largely comes out down to PR stunts and damage control.
Oh, absolutely. The thing with cold-heartedness is that it's not necessarily a bad thing, because although businesses may say, look, there's a profit opportunity here by shamelessly exploiting this, take the fair trade movement. You notice businesses are jumping on board it because they notice a shift in the market towards fair trade products. Business ethics are guided by the ethics of the consumer.
All right. We'll continue this discussion after our first song of the day. This is a song about the Occupy Wall Street movement. This is 99 Revolutions by Green Day.
Got 99 problems with a revolution, ain't one. Hello, and welcome back to Political Party, where we have heated discussions during the breaks.
Yeah, we are talking about the ethics of business at the moment. And Peter's going to introduce us to this new wave of change in international business as we see it.
Sure. Well, I think that if you break it down into sort of the developing world and the developed world, compared to initially, then the problem is that you kind of think everyone in the developed world is a robot, and everyone in the developing world is also a robot. But if you look at it, like today's society, that what companies really want to do in the developed world, so they want to make customers as happy as possible in order to be promoters of their product. This is called the Net Promoter System, and it's actually taken a lot of companies completely revolutionized how they work. Telstra is a good example, Westpac's another good example, where they've decided that they're trying to delight their customers as much as possible to make you a promoter of that company. Like Apple is another great example. They try to really make you as happy with the product as possible, so they give you things like an upgrade in your iPhone if it's broken, better customer service, and it's really trying to delight you. So this is called the Net Promoter System, and it's basically making everyone really happy. So the good thing about this is that it means that all these businesses are changing the way that they do business because it's in their interest to make you a promoter of their business. What happens when you promote their business? If you recommend it to your friends, you're more loyal to that customer, you spend more money with them. So, at the end of the day, the ultimate outcome of capitalism is that it regulates capitalism, is that it makes so many people in the developed world really, really happy. But then you might be thinking, But what about the developing world? We haven't liberated out the sort of term called wage slavery in the developing world. But if you look
Downward harmonization.
sorry,
Don't keep going. I should have interrupted.
Well, actually, nowadays we're kind of seeing upward harmonization in the developed world. That's what you're saying.
Let me
With,
finish
the
because I
happy
completely
husbands.
disagree
Anyway,
with
please
you.
do. Anyway, please do go on.
all right, I'll be brief. So those companies that, like Apple, for example, that manufactures in China and everywhere in the world, that we can say, oh, look at these terrible conditions and look at how tough it is to be the labor in this country. And of course, like child labor is one thing that's been regulated against. Those international companies actually look really bad when they employ child labor. But I think if you take it as what the normal Portuguese practice is, that they're far better than the local options for those people. Say people buy into want to work at the factory, and that's actually they have superior wages, they have better living conditions because they know they're going to be scrutinized as well. So it actually is the standard of manufacturing standard in those countries. People that are employed actually have a job compared to not having a job in the first place. So many people are better off in both the developing and developed world.
Okay. Firstly, on the sorry, what was that term you used to net promoter system? Yeah, that's like very similar to the way political parties work. They don't try to in a lot of instances apply their like specifically minor parties with niche values don't particularly try to throw their views at liberal people because they think it's a useless cause. They galvanize the support of their willing supporter base, so then those supporters will then go and support that message as a whole. I think that's a great marketing strategy, and that's good. Like that definitely helps companies in terms of competition, but I don't think that necessarily makes capitalism any better or worse, because at the end of the day, you've still got children working for, working in factories for money that's just enough to suffice them, but just enough to keep them coming back, even though it might not be enough. Like Apple has this system where it's like it contracts different factories and they're allowed to do whatever practices they want.
Not quite.
But let me finish. Apple has a code of conduct that it makes each factory sign. Those factories sign that code of conduct. But that factory is only getting a finite amount of money from Apple. And in order for that factory to profit, because Apple, they need Apple more than Apple needs them. There's competition for that job. So Apple will contract this company, sign our code of conduct. That company has those companies, as I learnt researching the topic last year, is that these companies will abuse those human rights anyway, and that's fine. It's technically not Apple's fault, but Apple's not liable for this breach of like human rights laws and stuff that happens, like poor working conditions, unfair wages, that they're supposed to be held to account, but in practice it doesn't happen.
Compare that to like what they would otherwise be doing, they would be factories with worse conditions, with poorer wages, and no standards.
But better than worse still isn't good.
Now, I do hate to sound brutal and cynical, but here's the thing. Poor working conditions are an inevitable feature of an industrializing society. I mean, you look at the UK in the 19th century and it's one of the most socially progressive countries when it comes to workers' rights now. But back then, there were children working in tin mines, coal mines, children working in factories. Look at Charles Dickens and his writing about all the orphan children who are working in factories. It's going to happen in these industrializing societies to guarantee they remain competitive. It's just going to happen.
But like depending on where you are in the stage of development, that there are associated circumstances with things like this. And although we can like point and be horrified at like why some people live on less than $1 a day in a lot of the developing world, but the things that dollar can actually buy are significantly higher than a country in Australia. But also that's just based on the conditions of that standard of development, and they're moving out of that. It will take a couple of generations, but it's better than the alternative. I think it's like no business, subsistence living, but then you have high child mortality
The way I see it, the preservation of culture in these countries that allows them to enjoy their subsistent lifestyle is incompatible with the Western system of sending NGOs in to help them. Because the problem with the NGOs is, yes, they may start off by introducing medication, but they're going to bring with them their Western values, their Western culture. And Tim is looking very happy about arguing over this with me, which is good because this is really the crux of the debate. NGOs will bring in their Western values, their Western culture. So what originally started as a means to slow down child mortality is going to grow into cultural imperialism, and it's going to essentially force them to start working in businesses.
I'm not quite sure that, like, just having a Western lifestyle is necessarily bad.
Oh, no. It's just the question of, does it justify the removal of a pre-existing culture?
I think we have, this is the whole sort of convergence and divergence debate. Our cultures coming together, converging, becoming one globalized culture, or we have these divergent cultures where we just have, like, a very unique tribe and, like, a white Australia. I think that a more, like, convergent culture of a globalized society where we actually engage with other cultures. We're not scared about involving ourselves with what it means to be another culture. It's actually a really good thing. It's a positive step.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, speaking as a member of the dominant culture, I think that cultural homogenization is a good thing for human unity and for the future, because it means we're less likely to attack each other. You're seeing a degree of this cultural homogenization with the internet. You're seeing much greater understanding being facilitated between people of different nations, even when they've never met each other, through the great leveler of the internet. Tim, what are your thoughts?
You compared a corporation forcing a state to enslave their children. Well, not to enslave, sorry. They have a certain amount of agency to decide whether or not they want to go in. I think that's what you two are saying about how they can choose to earn wages or not. But when the international system, and, you know, like, I hate to be on the side of China and Russia, of all countries, about this, but in the international system, the complaint is that this WTO neoliberal, you know, laissez-faire capitalism free-for-all that's happened is like, cool, your country's not going to survive if you don't trade with us. So you need money. How do you get money? By exploiting, you know, whatever you can to generate capital for your country, which in turn leads to development and modernization. I get that. But when these countries have no other option but to create competition in the international system, what they then have to do is they're forced into letting international corporations extract their fuel, like BP in Angola, for example, or Apple in, I think it's Taiwan, right? Where they go, cool, you've got no choice but to compete, and here we are offering you the money. So you're forced to let them come into your country. I don't agree that there's much agency behind that decision for
I
that
agree
country.
entirely.
And then what happens then is that in those countries, the businesses pop up like that manufacture like copper parts for iPhone motherboards, for example. And then there's the companies that assemble those and create motherboards. Then they send those motherboards to the US where they can just be put together by a little machine and say that, you know, assembled in the US or whatever. But what I'm saying is there's not much agency for developing countries to decide whether or not they want to compete, because if they don't, they die. And if they do accept these corporations that come into these countries, what you've got is people who are then forced to exploit other people so that they can generate the capital that government needs to be viable internationally. The difference between NGOs and corporations is that NGOs are there to create safeguards to protect and enable people to have their human rights. NGOs will create like clean water dispensing fountains, and NGOs will build schools and teach people how to teach their own people. They will teach them English, which will, you know, I guess you could say that that's imperialistic a bit, and I'll agree with that. But like corporations, their job, as you said, is to make the most profit. They don't give a shit about their human rights, only to the extent to which they're going to look good to their shareholders. NGOs are there to look out for those human rights and to protect those states from often, you know, tyrannical regimes, whether or not that's in the form of a dictator or whether that's in form of a military junta, as we saw with NGOs in Burma, or whether it's in the case of the tyranny of corporations borderline enslaving countries such as Shell in Nigeria and that government collusion to ultimately hurt the people in that country.
I mean, the thing is, the way I see it, it's kind of a them and us situation. We, as the governments of, governments, I'm not a government, but I'm thinking as one, as a government of a first world nation, it's really them and us situation. I want us to have the best possible quality of life so I get re-elected. And I don't care about them. I'm going to trot on them to do it. If there was a way in which my companies could see increased profits and there were no benefits for the people we outsource to, I would still go ahead and do it because screw you. You're not us. You can't do anything about it. What are you going to do? Denounce us in the UN? See, like, they're going to do the thing with Western governments is we are trying to keep these countries down as possible so that they continue to be dependent on us, so that we continue to have an enormous amount of leverage over them,
Correct.
so that our corporations can exploit them. And
we'll talk about this after the song because this is a great discussion.
Oh no, I think this is the Western government, not businesses as a whole. But they're not. I would argue to
Let's
an
go
extent.
To a song. Okay, we'll go to a song and we'll come back to you in 4 minutes. This is a song about exploitation and the unfair lean of capitalist systems. This is Enter Shikari with Gandhi, mate, Gandhi.
Good thing if Auntie's not here.
And we're back.
Hello,
Hello.
everyone.
Welcome back to Political Party. We are talking about business ethics.
We're learning how to mind our
with
business.
dollar signs instead of S's in the title.
Holla, holla, get dollar.
Yeah.
YOLO swag.
So, right before the break, we were talking about dependence theory and how, corporations or governments or, like, even to a degree, some, like, crazy righties have said that NGOs are creating dependence as well. So
Crazy righties? Am I a crazy righty now?
No. Maybe. Anyway, Peter, you were talking particularly about why you don't think that governments are pursuing dependence. Do you want to explore that a bit more?
Yeah, sure. I think it goes back to this debate around is there like a zero-sum game in the international market for
What's
like
a zero-sum game, sorry?
So if China gets stronger, that means that Australia gets weaker, or that the US gets weaker, and that we can't allow other countries to get stronger because it means that we're going to be proportionally weaker to them. I think that like that question is a strong China bad? Like I don't think it is, and I'm sure Hamish can argue the other side, but I'll just say why like having developing economies being really strong and becoming developed economies is actually fantastic. And if you look at the case of Japan or Korea, they're perfect examples of they've just been recently industrialized. And what happened was that you get Toyota, Samsung, all of these great, fantastic inventions coming from these, what were like fishing villages, and the information technology that has sprung up from them. We could also now sell all of our products to them. It means that we are richer, not only in technology and opportunity, but we can actually buy things for cheaper and get some of their stuff. That's why it's great to have strong China, because they're just going to mean that and like India, for example, Tata, and some of the industrial advantages that we have now, that like cheap outsourcing of our call centers, for example, means that we just don't have to pay as much for our telecommunications.
Well, look, this stuff is good for the consumer, but you're still reinforcing my point about it being a zero-sum world, because you talk about all these emerging industries in these emerging countries. Look what happened in the West. These industries left the West and went to these countries. These Western countries lost some of their market share. They lost some of those industries. I mean, take Britain. British Leyland used to be one of the largest car manufacturers in the world, producing such things as, you know, the iconic Mini, the Rovers. Now look, they're owned by Tata Motors. The Indian market took over and is now swallowing up these failing Western car manufacturers because India are allowed to develop too much. And in South Korea, you talk about industries, telcos, they would have all been Western. It would have been a Western-dominated sector if it weren't for the industrialization of these states. Shipbuilding used to be dominated by Britain, the United States, France. Now look, it's all done in Korea because they developed faster than we could manage. So from that point of view, our influence in the West has been weakened, and these industries really are a zero-sum game.
They took our jobs!
Well, like, yeah, they took some of our jobs, but the thing is that if you think about it as like, oh, now we've lost a lot of our ability to manufacture and do things in our own countries. But then if you think about how much the pie has actually grown, how much we now have more shipping and cheaper stuff, and more technology that's come out, if you look at how much we were doing before that in a Western controlled system without a developed world, it was far lower than in today. And I know that's because the world has grown, but it's because it's grown in those developing countries that the world has grown, that we can like produce infinite amounts more. Like it's gone on an exponential growth curve. And I think that's a great thing. You can argue that as well. But like we can do so much more today. Everyone's life is so much better off. And that's because like, especially in those developing countries, like just the human side of things is that there were so many people starving to death in those countries, or there was war and conflict because they didn't have like a good business structure that created a middle
and
class.
corrupt government.
But this leads into another interesting philosophical debate. Is it better to die free or live a slave? A slave to a corporation, a slave to a corrupt dictator?
But that wasn't the dichotomy
No.
in Korea. It was get invaded
No,
by
not in
Japan or work really hard and then like build an economy that can like stand on its own and be strong.
But here's the thing. Through the 70s, 50s and 70s in South Korea, it was a horrible dictatorship.
Yeah.
People were slaves to the corporations and to the dictators.
Look at them now.
Yeah, well, that's where slavery gets you, I suppose.
That's where education gets
Yeah,
you.
education and like being able to afford your kids a good education and better lifestyle while
Take heed, America.
Well, education definitely leads to more innovation. I can agree with that.
Absolutely.
I think that like India's like booming middle class is creating more education opportunities, and they're like then better able to like innovate in the technology sector, which they have the fastest growing tech sector.
I agree
in the world.
entirely, and I also agree with your point that, all this stuff is only beneficial for consumers. Like, all this competition...
No, well, people in India are getting more education, and that's inherently a good thing.
Yeah,
it's just reserved
exactly.
to the middle class.
But I mean, like, your point about...
I think the poor, like the amount of poor proportional in society is dropping significantly.
Yes. And also the level to which people are poor. Because, I mean, you look at Britain 100 years ago, people who are poor were, like, living out in the gutter, and now at least they get to live in public housing and spend their
iPhone.
Spend their social services on imitation Burberries.
Yeah.
Chaps.
Hold on.
You what, mate?
The amount of poor proportionally is going down.
And the left.
Sure, it is, because
and then the quality of life.
More money is going to fewer people. So what you get is the gross, there's like this crazy statistic, like the top, like 200 richest people in America have more money collectively than 50% poorest.
The inequality debate.
The inequality debate, which I'm not sure you guys want to have that.
No, I'll have it, because I think that like
we've got
inequality.
5 minutes anyway,
I
so
shy away
I'm
from
gonna,
nothing.
I'm gonna push it.
Inequality is not in like, yes, it's not the best way to have a society that is massively, you got huge rich and huge poor. But the thing is, when like the reason why inequality is not as bad as the other option is because the other option is that everyone's a lot poorer off. So the poor are poorer and the rich are poorer, but the gap between them is smaller. The difference is in an unequal society, like not including South Africa where it's pretty bad, but that's the worst country in the world for inequality, by the way. But compare South Africa to its neighbors, their neighbors are pretty jealous of South Africa. Anyway, like a super unequal society like the US, for example, where there is a lot of wage discrepancy and super poor and rich, but that's better than everyone being poor and more equal.
But, like, when you've got everyone poor and more equal, everyone still has more money. Like, the problem is that too few people have too much of that gross capital.
But that's always going to happen.
So what... Yeah, right, that's always going to happen until you regulate it. Like, what happens
like
is
inheritance tax.
Sorry?
Inheritance tax?
Well, yeah, or, like, socialism. Like, on the extreme end
the
of the
dirty
scale.
word.
like, the problem I've got with that is that, sure, you've got less poor proportionally, but if you look proportionally at who has the most amount of money and you put that on I forgot what that graph's called, the
Gini coefficient.
interquartile range, right? If you did that with society, you'd find that far more of members of the public in general have less money than the rich proportionally. That means that we're all kind of poor.
But why is that bad? Like, if
Actually,
you have, like, super rich, that it's pretty good, but then you look at the super poor proportional to the rich.
Because the
their
rich
quality
look out
of
for
life.
each other.
But like,
you've got like a
it's a
business
dog-eat-dog
that's
world.
failing.
That's
Let me
capitalism.
propose my money sink theory. So in any society run and operated by humans, there will always be people who are born luckier than you, smarter than you. These people will accrue money to them because of their intelligence, because of their luck, and they will always end up dominating whatever society they're in through their influence. Any type of society will have these people. Any
Sure,
type.
because that perpetuates the cycle where poor people can't get educated and the poor get poorer.
But it's any,
like-
any society run by humans.
But the
is what
poor
I'm saying.
aren't getting poorer. The poor are getting richer, while the rich are getting even richer.
There's
Yeah.
people who don't have homes.
Yeah, but like there were
They don't
less
have
of them
human rights, right?
than,
Like when-
than
like,
they were like 10 years ago.
They refuse to build, they refuse to put these people in houses, but when a business is failing, they throw in some, like in the US's case after the GFC, trillions and trillions of dollars of indebted money and quantitative easing at these companies so they can have money to bail them out, but they can't afford like a little lookout for people who are like
That's because the
ravaged
companies,
by the current system. Like,
Not
it's
only
just
the
not
com-
fair.
not only the
You
company,
can't
Well,
justify people
not-
being left in the gutter. So
You can justify giving
so
to
the
the
rich, so
banks
the rich
billions
can
of
support
dollars,
each
though.
other.
of course you
And
can't
so the
justify
business and so the government can
I can
consistently
justify
privatize
something.
business that aren't going to look out for the people that need it most.
But here's the thing, even if you can't justify it, it's still inevitable because we're not living in a system that works on justification. We're living in an amoral system that just works. And the reason why
and
these-
that's fucked.
No, I think we live in a very moral system with laws and regulations, and that people are always trying to like not be horrible to one another. At least to like have a nice life and not go to jail at the bare minimum. But just going back to your example of like what happened in the GFC, if they didn't bail out the banks, then everyone with their money in the bank would have lost all of their money. And imagine being a person with savings and losing all of that. Isn't that worse off? And that's what happened in the Depression, right? When all the banks failed versus like what we saw at the GFC. We didn't have a depression. We just had a couple of like 7 years of like slow growth. That's probably better than a depression.
although it has set up the scene for being screwed over in the future. But here's
But
the
that's
thing.
the future though.
There are other reasons why these politicians would do it. It's because these politicians themselves have stakes in this business. They're getting money from these banks, so they don't want them to fall because that would be their money gone. Like, the poor people don't really matter. Whether the poor people get paid or not, the government isn't going to really notice so much. Like, to as much of an extent as the banks being alive. Of course they're going to notice to some degree because there'll be less, like, homeless, more money being spent in the economy, but they still don't care as much as they do about the banks.
And I think we've just reached the end game of the debate there because, like, Hamish was talking about how the current system works as long as it perpetuates these systems, and in the future we're going to encounter issues. And then you said, but that's the future.
No, I think that like the future's getting so much better, and it's so fantastic because
Is it?
we're
We're going to be dead in 110 years.
It's simultaneously getting better and worse the way I see it. It's getting better because things like 3D printing and so forth are becoming more and more affordable. We're going to see more and more decentralization. But at the same time, we're going to see this global underclass. So even though we're going to have a global underclass, their standard of living will be higher than any other societies in history
well,
because of this cheap technology.
I think the best indicator of the future is the past. And if you look at like how even the poorest of the poor have gotten so much better off in their quality of life and the technology, and they're like, even the people on welfare, like, is so much better than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And that's because the pace of society has drastically improved everyone's life. Yes, they're super rich, and like, that's probably not the best thing to have like Gina Reinhardt. I don't really want her having a whole lot of,
Such a bitch.
yeah, whatever.
Whoa!
That's right, shots fired.
Unnecessary.
Anyway, so, it's good that we have, development in society, because if you look at the past, everyone's gotten better off. And I think that's the future of the world. By the way, everyone should see Tomorrowland. Great film. Answers all your questions. But like, tomorrow is a good future. And I think you just need to be optimistic about it and try to like make it better by allowing business to innovate and making the world a better place by like going out there and actually working your butt off.
The way I see it, you need to understand how the world works. You need to understand that it is an amoral system, that having a super rich class and a mostly poor society is human nature. You need to understand the system, know how it works, and that way you'll be able to use it and benefit. But you're right, the standard of living for the poorest is going to continue improving. So, without further ado, let's move on to our next song. This next song is Sleep Now in the Fire by Rage Against the Machine. A nice song about Western imperialism and the spreading of democracy, and our history is frozen, and democracy has been proven as the only ideology, and US colonialism, and it's really great. Anyway, here we go.
So
This is what happens when your computers are made by child slaves.
our Mac, which is the product of a capitalist system and child exploitation and all the good stuff that we spoke about earlier, has just cacked itself. And given that Apple has like a monopoly over fixing that,
Kind of like everything in the Soviet Union, which was technically a socialist, or arguably a socialist system. Or China, made in China.
Soviet Russia was straight up like authoritarian communism. I think that's very different.
More people died in the Great Leap Forward than World War II.
Yeah, I know.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
People underestimate what
The
a
Great Leap
bastard
Forward
Mao-
was the most brutal system that the world has ever seen.
but
That
here's-
was straight up slavery and exploitation.
Here's why people underestimate how bad Mao was. Mao was friends with Nixon, therefore he's not our enemy, so we should look at him in a positive light. Whereas screw the Soviets, screw Khrushchev and his efforts to build, like, community housing. He went against us in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Do you want to continue the song? Or not?
Up to you.
Uh,
I reckon.
We'll go without it. People don't listen to the songs anyway. So we're gonna wrap up just our debate with some concluding thoughts. We've spoken about like dependence and different strategies for marketing and like the morals of development and stuff. And I don't know. Hamish, what do you think?
Well, I
at the
see
end?
it. We live in an amoral system that works only to serve its own ends, and by telling all of you this, and by educating you, I'm kind of screwing myself over in the future, because I'm sharing my knowledge of the system with all of you, allowing you to compete with me to get into the really wealthy class. But another thing I realized about development in other countries is that businesses want it. States don't, but businesses do, because businesses see these countries as potential markets. That's been a part of China's strategy in Africa, to invest in Africa, is to build up China as a potential market for their products so that the businesses can export to them and buy them. So businesses, in a way, really do have an interest in seeing the world become wealthier because more markets, more profits.
Cool. Well, the way I see it is, I guess I'm an optimist. I think that business and the way that society is going in a capitalist direction with, proper regulation is actually fantastic, because it means that the poorest of the poor are far better off than they were in historical terms. And if that's in real terms, like your quality of life, your level of education, everything is much more accessible. The advent of the internet, for example. So we started this debate is the pursuit of profit evil? And I think that it's not. I think that the self-interested nature of business ultimately wants to make consumers happy. And that makes so many people's lives better off, whether it's in the developed world or in the developing world. And of course, there's going to be controversy. Of course, there's going to be missteps there, but on parts of both players. But I think that, we can get through it together, and that the world is going to be a very bright future for us all. And I'm pretty optimistic about it. So I don't think there will be this like dystopia of two classes. I think that we're all going to be better off.
But the thing is, even if it is
Shameless plug for our future week.
even if it is, yeah, exactly. Even if it is a dystopia, it's still going to see a higher level of standard of living for the poor than any other society in history. It's just still going to end up with this underclass, this upper class, but the underclass will still enjoy a very high quality of life.
Is that a bad thing?
Up to you, the viewer, rather the listeners, I suppose. I don't think it's particularly bad.
I mean, if everyone had the exact same everything, I don't think that would be like a society that I'd particularly want to live in, because you'd just be like, oh, I'll just go and like play computer games all day because that's pretty fun. But like, that's
the rich people aren't satisfied with life because they have everything. They have nothing to look forward to, nothing to try and earn. Whereas we, the lower class, you feel really happy when you buy your new expensive computer or bicycle or whatever it is you ordinary people buy. Whatever it is.
That's not happiness. That's
Is it
manufactured happiness. That's
It's still
consumerism.
That's a hedonistic treadmill.
It's the opiate of the masses, the modern opiate of the masses, but you're still feeling good, and isn't that ultimately what you want from life?
Well, I think that the way that we're marketed to want things and buy things is actually not a great thing in itself. But I think that like on the rich people having nothing to do. I think that if you look at like people like Bill Gates and so many philanthropists, is they actually champion a lot of really good causes, and they actually want to change the world for the better. So if you have abundance amount of money, that's a cool thing that you can do what you want, and most of that is actually like
Bono,
it's helping
Bono,
a lot of people.
Bill and Melinda Gates
No, but
and
it's
Warren
because-
Buffett are willing to pledge huge amounts of their estates.
These rich
Or
people-
Elon Musk,
these-
who's like,
yeah.
I want to have space travel.
Yeah.
I want to go see the stars.
These rich
and he's
people
doing it.
realize there's nothing they can spend their money on for themselves that will make them happy. The only way they can be happy is through this philanthropic stuff.
But you
through
just
this
called
technology
Gina
development.
Reinhardt a bitch for the same reason.
That's because she advocates monopolistic practices that will screw
But that's
people
what
over.
gets profit.
It is, but she's just not very nice about it, not very good at PR.
Okay.
You
Well,
gotta be
I
good
think
at
it
PR.
depends on like your faith in humans at the end of the day. Do you believe that people are going to just be out to get as much money as possible? Or do you think at a point you get saturated with money and like, you're just like, what do I really care about? And I think this probably goes back to sort of the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's. It's like you self-actualize at the end of the day when you're feel fulfilled on a lot of other levels. And that really is a good thing.
Well, it depends on the individual, doesn't it? What are your thoughts, Tim?
I'm just gonna let loose for about a minute here. I don't think we live in an amoral society. In fact, I think that we, as well as the international community, lives in almost a wholly moral society wherein everybody has morals. Everybody knows that there's problems with this system. Everybody knows that we have the tools to like mobilize and fix these problems. You guys even like conceded that business is great to the extent where it's regulated. Like, I think that, we can't just, blindly consume finite and depleting resources until, it comes a time when the environment's destroyed and they're poorest and no one can help themselves and the human race is inevitably doomed. I don't think that we can just, like, run out of every resource to the extent where we're going to have to, go to war with other countries and blow them up and, take control of their areas to get control of a finite amount of resources like ISIS are doing with Syrian oil wells, as well as what the US did with Iraq. I don't think that's a particularly useful use of human time.
Just go into space and grab the resources, no problem.
Yeah, Hamish's theory from last week or the week before was that sure, we're probably gonna destroy this planet, so let's just get a new one
Interstellar.
and innovate and just go to new planets.
Yeah, just harvest the resources out of every planet and keep moving on. Leave a path of exploited and barren worlds in our wake. Nah, but here's the thing. There are imagine the Earth before anyone had ever taken any of its resources. That is what these planets are like. There are resources there for the taking that will fuel our society for millions of years to come. No matter how
in
big it
2
gets.
weeks from today, we have our final episode, which is about the future, and Hamish is going to let loose on his
I'm
theories
so
about
excited.
the future. And
Well-
coincidentally, next week is about conspiracies, where Hamish is also going to let loose on his theories about the future.
I feel there's a theme going here.
Yeah. Yeah. At
But-
the end of the day, I just think the current system, all it does is perpetuate war and poverty and corruption and collusion and inequality. And whether or not you want to say that business is standing for gender equality, only a couple of businesses are actually doing that.
Because that's where
like-
profit is.
The businesses who are, not paying, people equitable wages all came out with that ad in the Herald Sun where they all put their logos together and said support marriage equality, but equality for no one else. I just think all the current system does is fuck everyone over. I think we need to, at least at the base level, keep what we've got and regulate businesses to the extent where everybody in the supply chain and on the consumer end can have their human rights and can live glorified,
has human
dignified
rights.
lives.
Can I say one thing? I know I probably
Sure.
lost my turn.
Go for it.
Just on the future
Close the debate,
and
yeah.
the future of this program. So I think on the exploiting many planets, if we get fusion, we don't need to exploit any planets. We got free energy.
We'll need to get more hydrogen eventually.
Just like mine the sun or something like
Yeah,
that.
exactly. No, it's fine. There are massive
What-
clouds of the stuff floating in space.
Yeah, plenty of stuff in space. And then on sort of one topic that if you invite me back, perhaps next semester.
Are you coming to the future week?
I've got exams and full-time work.
Look, I'll continue running the show next semester. So
Cool. Well, there's one issue that we could talk about, and that's is advertising and the mass consumerization selling us the dream of to be happy, you have to buy a Coke or have that Gillette razor.
Hedonistic treadmill.
Here we go.
Is that a good thing? And like, I think it's not. And then the consumerism in itself, and I think I regret it to an extent. And that's about it for me.
All right. Well, let's move on
Cool.
to some parody news.
We're just like our quick wrap-up segment that we do every week. Hamish, do you want to explain the rules of this game?
All right. So I will read out an article title, and you will tell me if you think it's a real article or if it's from The Onion or The Shovel. So without
Me?
both of you.
Oh, okay.
Tim doesn't know.
I don't
Tim
know what these titles are.
Exactly.
Hamish just lets loose with this stuff. He
So
follows
without
it all
ado,
week.
here we go with the first title. When I saw this headline, I thought it just had to go on this week. So, cow escapes slaughterhouse, goes on the run, gets shot next to McDonald's. True or
That
false?
sounds like way too specific to be false. Plus, I can imagine cows getting shot because they've escaped. So
I'd say false.
Well, it's true.
you're kidding.
Isn't that great? So next article, we go to Nation braces itself as politicians announce plan to use their conscience.
I
False.
think that's like a. I think that's Australian government's about to do with gay marriage.
So you reckon it's false?
Yeah.
It is false.
Yeah.
But still pretty funny. I mean, could you imagine the consequences if politicians actually did use their conscience? It'd be the end of business as we know it.
Yes.
So, let's go to the next article. McDonald's, unable to fix its dismal monthly sales numbers, will now just stop sharing them.
False. Absolutely false.
I think that's true. I think that's like some like hyperbolized title, but nonetheless, I think that McDonald's are probably going to like lessen the amount of statistics that they show about their company. I don't know.
And it is in fact true.
What?
But they are a public company.
Big
They
business,
have to.
accountability, transparency, buzzwords, synergy.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Maybe I should be a little less incredulous.
Yeah, maybe. So our next article is Joe Hockey scraps entire GST system to avoid talking about tampons. And I mean, we've heard that there was in fact a protest in front of Parliament House by people dressed as tampons. So
Yeah. I think that's false. But nonetheless, that's what Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott are disagreeing on at the moment, which is beautiful stuff.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't agree.
it's false.
Yeah.
Speaking of corporations, new Pizza Hut meal comes with syringe to inject food directly into arteries.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not true.
That's definitely false, but that sounds like something that the Americans would go for.
It really does, doesn't it?
Just suck it to my
I mean, it is false, but like they've got so much fat in their arteries already, you know.
It's like the Romans, what they used to do.
Yeah.
Did they really?
No. They just would eat until they were too stuffed,
yeah,
and then
and then
they'd
they'd
throw
throw
up,
up,
and
yeah.
then they'd eat again, just so they could just be gluttonous
Yeah,
and eat more.
the ultimate hedonistic society.
No.
The Romans were really hedonistic.
They also had like a much lower population.
Do you know that in Pompeii, they illustrated the way to the brothel by having winged phallic symbols on the roads
Interesting.
in Pompeii? There's
Hmm.
a lot more. Roman culture is a lot more sexualized than the Victorian era would have you believe.
Yeah, there were a lot of phallic symbols
I mean, look,
around.
the Italians are descended from the Romans, so
To an extent, we all are.
but the modern Italians inherited their culture directly from the Romans. So I'm not saying that explains why they always hit on all the women and so forth, but final one.
Yep.
Judge orders woman to walk 30 miles for bailing on cab fare.
That sounds true.
Yeah, I'll go true.
It is true.
Yes.
Unbelievable.
Quite funny, isn't it? That's quite a fitting sentence, isn't it? Anyway, I believe that's all for this episode of Political Party.
Tis. It's been an excellent show this
It
week.
has. Lots of good
I'm
discussion.
sure that
Thoroughly
we
enjoyed it.
put enough information out there for our listeners to make their own decisions, because we certainly didn't come to any conclusions.
Make
With
up your
looks
own
like
mind.
Parliament, except without the sticking up for
Without the
minorities.
lawmaking.
Yes. Peter, thank you very much for joining us on the show this week. Thank you for sharing your expertise.
My pleasure. I'm a
Yeah.
big fan, so thank you very much.
And now I guess you'll have to peter out.
That's...
On that note, Political Party.
It's a victory in the debate for Peter.
On that note, political party, putting the cool in political.
2 episodes to go, everyone. See you later.